almost don't want to make this video, because the F-15 has been my favorite fighter jet for the longest time, and I just got through covering how awesome it is. But after digging up whatever I could find on this plane, I kind of just have to face the music, because this thing is better. Today we're going to talk about the first and one of the scariest 4th generation fighter jets on the planet ever, the F-14 Tomcat, aka the turkey or the tennis court. This plane is America's cultural icon. It showed up in a lot of items over the years, ranging from kids shows like G.I. Joe, plenty of toys, video games like the early Ace Combat games, and even a few anime. Which kind of makes sense on that last one. I mean, the Japanese like Transformers enough to pretty much invent the genre known as giant freaking robots. Makes sense they'd like a plane that does the same thing. But the most significant contribution to the Tomcat's cultural value hands down comes from movies. The two biggest being Top Gun, where Tom Cruise flew one of these things around after the movie intro showcased F-14 aardvarks launching from the carrier deck, and Final Countdown, which I can basically summarize as a military fanfic writer's wet dream about what would happen if you sent a fully crewed Nimitz supercarrier back to World War II against the Japanese. But the absolute icon that we have today started from some very humble beginnings. Back in the mid-1960s, the United States Navy had gotten sick and tired of playing the engineering game known as the F-111 program. The F-111B was supposed to be a one-stop shop tactical fighter interceptor for all the Air Force's and Navy's needs. But after rising cost overruns, delays, and the simple fact that the plane wasn't capable of meeting the Navy's shifting requirements for carrier operations, it was clear it wouldn't make the cut for the Navy and the program was canceled. While the F-111 would become the Air Force's premier strike fighter, the Air Force and Navy both agreed they wanted something else and developed their own projects going forward. The Air Force would go on to initiate the FX program, while the Navy would outline their requirements for the VFAX. Although because McNamara was still on a standardization tangent, the FX and VFAX had to be different versions of the same plane. As a result, the Air Force decided to try and get the Navy to accept a navalized F-15, better known as the F-15N Sea Eagle.
And they took exception to that.
See, the problem was that the Navy wanted a replacement for both the F-111B program, designed to be a long-range interceptor, but also, upon recognizing the deficiencies of the F-4 Phantoms in Vietnam, there was a high drive to add dogfighting to the list of jobs, since it was figured these fighters might need to handle both the Soviet bombers they would hunt down and their new escort fighters. And while the Sea Eagle did improve on the dogfighting element, in the interceptor role it would be stuck with shooting the same Sparrow missiles the Phantom had used. And the Navy wasn't going to have any of that because they wanted their new jet to use the long-range $500,000 AIM-54 Phoenix missiles. See, the Phoenix and the radar typically associated with its launch, the AWG-9, had a lot of time and money put into their developments over the course of several planes. Those planes ranged from the F-4D Missileer and the experimental YF-12 Interceptor, which used the same Mach 3 chassis as the SR-71. And for all the curse the AIM-4 Falcon had been in Vietnam, one good thing had come of it, by way of becoming the basis for the AIM-54. The AIM-54 came from the AIM-47, which came from the AIM-26, which was a bigger version of the AIM-4. Why did they want to make it bigger, you ask? Because they wanted to put a nuclear warhead in it. The AIM-26 became the first production air-to-air nuclear missile. Because here in capitalist America, we're all about getting more bang for our buck. The only real question is who's getting the bang, because America just decided to apply next-day shipping in bulk to the art of pan-frying your soul. We were going to turn somebody's hemisphere into a toaster oven. I came here to make a video about a fighter jet, and suddenly here I am finding out that at some point America treated bomber formations like a hungry college student treats a frozen Hot Pocket.
I swear to God, it makes it taste better.
This is a completely different take on 30 seconds at max power, and I am here for it. And the spicy microwaves could fly out and destroy targets as far away as 120 miles from a head-on merge position. That is about a third of the maximum width of the British Isles. So it's no real wonder that the Navy wanted these flying culinary appliances bolted onto whatever new interceptor they got. And the Sea Eagle couldn't carry them. Consequently, the Navy began looking into 3 unsolicited bids for a carrier-based interceptor with variable geometry wings, or swing wings. These wings basically swing forward and back, which changes the amount of air flowing over their length, thanks to the power of triangles. If you swing it forward, more of the air flowing over the wings travels down the length, aka the chord, and generates lift. But if you're going at the speed of Mach Jesus, that amount of air will start becoming a shockwave, which sucks all the speed out of the air and destroys that lift. So the only solution is to start hacking the matrix and control how fast the air moves. By By sweeping the wings back, the air effectively travels more slowly down the length of the wing, not because it's defying the laws of physics, but because most of the airflow gets redirected down the length of the wing and doesn't contribute to your lift total. I'm trying to tell you that when your plane's a literal transformer, you can fly fast and land slow, which are the exact qualities a carrier interceptor needs, and the exact ideas those three bidders had in mind. McDonnell Douglas submitted a prototype F4 Phantom rework called the F4J VGS, or as I've also seen, the VFS. This was a swing wing version of the F4J Phantom that honestly looks more like a MiG-23, and it was a much cheaper option because it used the frame of an aircraft that was already in production. In fact, 57% of its parts would be the same across both models. However, it was still a Phantom and couldn't carry the flying toaster ovens, so that one was off the table. The next in line was the Ling Temco Vought, or LTV, V507, aka the Vagabond. This massive conglomerate effort included Lockheed and even Dassault Aviation from France, where they effectively copied their attempt at a swing-wing, twin-engine prototype version of the Mirage called the Mirage G8. However, this model was actually thrown out first because it was kind of like a haughty celebrity. The company thought their reputation with the Crusader would do all the work for them, and at the end of the day, the design wasn't all that special. So after they got kicked out in 1968, followed by Old McDonald's Aircraft Farm on February 3rd, 1967, the only prototype left was the Grumman G303.
Guess it's just you and me now.
They had to make some slight alterations, primarily splitting the vertical tail into two to make it shorter in the hangar and getting rid of that weird shark-looking fins down on the bottom there. But the Grumman 303 would still become the basis for the Navy's new VFX program. And since the standardization push was still kicking, though not for much longer, the Navy would actually try to force the Air Force to accept their fighter instead of the Eagle. So not only did the Navy almost get the Eagle, but the Air Force almost got the Tomcat. And the only reason neither one of them happened is because the branches acted like rebellious teenagers long enough to make their government parents give up on the project. They hit the government with so much teenage angst, they straight up out-bureaucrated the government just so they didn't have to share. Although there was one thing they did want to keep. The Navy wanted to move past the underpowered and unreliable 20,000-pound TF-30 engines that had powered the F-111B, so they agreed to a joint engine development program. However, this would eventually fall short as the naval F-100 engine variant the Tomcat was being designed for, the F-401, was suffering from a lot of technical issues. Despite the benefits of its projected 30,000 pounds of thrust, the F-401 was seeing about as many compressor stalls as the TF-30, while also having a much shorter lifespan and being way more expensive. The Navy's already getting aardvark flashbacks, so they changed plans to the TF-30s for the first round of Tomcats. They might suck, but at least they were available.
It ain't much, but it's honest work.
And since they were getting aardvark flashbacks, the Navy would then make sure they issued Grumman a fixed-price contract with a strict timeline. And if Grumman took too long or suffered any issues, it would have to be handled on their dime, not the Navy's. There was some allowance for cost overruns, allowing the unit price to extend to 125% of the original planned total, but at the end of the day, the Navy had still made the fatal assumption that they understood the dreaded I word: inflation.
There's one thing you didn't account for. My numbers are bigger than yours.
This wouldn't seem to be a problem at first when prototype number 1 made its first flight on December 21st, 1970, until 9 days later when that same prototype had a hydraulic failure on landing approach and crashed. Which doesn't seem like a big deal by itself, you kind of just make another one and move on. Plus, Grumman's a defense contractor, they're loaded for cash, right? Wrong. Because of the sheer volume of tax dollars being spent on civil and social initiatives at the time, combined with the expenses of the Vietnam War and probably a few other things, inflation started shooting through the roof in the late 1960s, and it would only get worse throughout the 70s, hitting a temporary peak when Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard in 71. Plus, the US defense budget shrank by about 5% that year. So when that first prototype went down in 1970, in the middle of labor inflation, a shrinking defense budget, and a production contract that had been cut in half, Grumman pretty much went up in flames overnight. The company had to speed up the development of another prototype to compensate for the testing hours they needed, because you can't just throw things out onto the field, especially when you consider how well that went over the last decade. That costs money. Then, the extra testing period caused them to miss the budget allotments for the new fiscal year, and thus any opportunity to have any orders placed. That costs money. All the while labor costs are rising across the board. Just to stay in business, Grumman decided to lay off 14,000 of their 36,000 workers, over a third of their entire workforce, and shut down half of their factory real estate. You know it's actually bad when they're not just running mass layoffs. The butterfly effect from the loss of just that one airplane cost Grumman $18 million US. In today's money, that is almost $142 million. You could almost buy 2 whole F-35As with that amount of money. The entire Tomcat program ended up being $65 million in debt, which cranks out to nearly $500 million today, with a B. That loss increased even more next year, and then the company CEO would die of a heart attack before Congress finally stepped in. They opened up the Grumman contract a little bit, allowing them to raise the flyaway price per airplane after they delivered the second batch, and NASA would also quietly offer Grumman a contract to build some sets of wings for the upcoming space shuttles to help them squeak by. But that wasn't nearly enough, and unsurprisingly, no civilian bank wanted to loan out to Grumman for help because all those recent events left him with what amounted to a credit score lower than the fucking Titanic. The only bailout option left was the federal government, and of course when they offered aid, they handed Grumman an interest rate of over 6% when the civilian rate was about 5%. Grumman would try to play smart and invest some of this into short-term government securities to help cover the interest, but if you've worked for the government before, then you know it's like a scholarship. You only get to put that money towards whatever they say you can. So Grumman got penalized for abusing government funds and then fined for all the marbles they got back, putting the company right back in the hole they started in.
I'm from the government and I'm here to help.
They would continue to struggle along until their only foreign buyer stepped in, Iran. After making contact with Iranian head generals and eventually the Shah himself, Iran would place an order for 30 Tomcats in January of 1974. Reinforcing Iran's commitment even further was the Iranian bank Melli, the largest bank in the Middle East, which was willing to front Grumman a loan to cover all remaining development costs until they started turning a profit. And this entire ordeal was going on while Grumman was telling off McDonnell Douglas for counteroffering the Sea Eagle and the occasional from the fighter mafia before finally delivering the very first F-14 in June of 1972, nicknamed the Tomcat. Now this name was decided both by Grumman's heritage of naming planes after cats and after Admiral Tom Connolly, the VFX program manager. And I know you guys are gonna hate me for saying this out loud, but it feels a bit wrong. And that's because the name Tomcat had almost been applied to the F-7F Tiger Cat 2 decades earlier, but Grumman had avoided that at the last minute because of its more adult implications. It kind of feels like you just have a cover story when you're named after an admiral, but I digress.
The more things change, the more they stay the same.
That said, the name would still be appropriate because almost immediately after its first sea deployment in 1974, the Tomcat would be very quickly recognized by its crews and eventually their enemies for its ability to make the bad guys take it. And the primary means of shafting its adversaries also worked against its operators, because the AWG-9 pulse Doppler radar is basically a mini reactor core. That radar puts out about 10.2 kilowatts of power, which is more than 10 times that of the Phantom and double that of the Eagle. And it could track 24 targets and engage 6 simultaneously in its track while scan mode, the max number of Phoenixes the Tomcat could carry. Granted, the Tomcat would only carry 4 in practice for landing weight reasons, and the radar was less accurate while used in this mode due to the longer update times, but at this point it's comedic effect, because nothing says you're a joke to me like the Tomcat slinging tactical toaster ovens at people up to 120 miles away after spotting them at up to 200 miles away.
I think his mate saw me. Yes, he did.
The radar on the Tomcat was the most powerful radar system in service until the F-22 Raptor came out. It could burn through jamming interference, and thanks to the electronic warfare antennas under the chin, they could also slave the radar to jam search and missile radars, a feature that was, notably, not given to the Iranian F-14s. And just in case some pesky politician decided you could only engage after visual confirmation, the Tomcat could just make them call hacks using its AXX-1 television camera system, which was slaved to the radar and lets pilots visually identify their targets before the enemy even knew they were in a fight at a distance. This let them target their radar-guided Phoenix missiles, or Sparrows if they felt like playing on Doom difficulty that day, usually from that nice, neat centerline placement. And it's that section of the plane that is way more important than it looks. Not only does it look clean, it is aerodynamically clean as well. See, storing the missiles between the engines helps to reduce the drag force caused by mounting them to a plane. And originally, the F-111B had planned to store its missiles internally to dodge drag entirely like it's the Matrix. However, this made the plane bigger and more complicated because of the extra moving parts, so the Tomcat tried a simpler, rougher version called Miss Me With That Shit and just mounted them down the center line. This helped save weight for the important parts, things like the missiles. Plus, that center channel could also act as a giant section of wing to help support the rest of the plane. This is called a blended wing body design, and this center body wing could on average generate about 40% of the plane's lift in flight. This reduced the strain on the wings themselves by decreasing the wing loading, aka the amount of weight each point on the wing has to support to keep the plane in flight. This also directly translated to being able to outturn even the MiG-21s that the Phantoms were having so much trouble with, and even flying with half a wing missing if they really needed to. Yeah, you guys thought the F-15 was the only fighter jet that could come home with wings missing, huh? On June 29, 1991, two Tomcats collided during a training exercise over the South China Sea. One had to eject, but the other managed to fly all the way back to Singapore with half a wing missing.
Not impressed! I can do that too!
And while I'm on that tangent, the Tomcat could actually land without a few things. There was a case when a Tomcat landed without its radome that had torn off mid-flight, went through the canopy, and injured the pilot. And then there's a video of another F-14 landing with a chunk of its right vertical tail missing. According to one commenter who claimed to be present for this, in 2003, two Tomcats collided over the Arabian Sea, and the other had to land with its wings still swept back for some reason. When the pilots had both landed, they were ordered over the radio to report for a urinalysis, you know, a piss test. Without skipping a beat, one of the pilots picks up the radio back and responds, "Sir, what makes you think I have piss left?" I'm pretty sure this design right here, this blended wing body, was what the Soviets were taking notes on when they designed the MiG-29 and the Su-27, because that thing could do work for the Tomcats even while carrying an air-to-air payload like those Phoenix missiles. Oh, and speaking of the Phoenixes, you know those big-ass missile rails for them? Those things contained oil coolers for the AIM-54As and their own built-in hoists for mounting them to the planes, which gave crews the unique flexibility of prepping the AIM-54s in the hangar and then full arming a Tomcat with 4 of them in like 20 minutes. And that was on top of the AIM-9 Sidewinders, not to mention the 20mm Vulcan Gatling cannon with 675 rounds. They almost had the chance to carry AMRAAMs later on, but they decided to retire them by that point, so we kind of got robbed out of that one.
Oh god damn it.
Or the Tomcat could carry bombs, which it wasn't allowed to do for a while because the Navy had that job handled and run around with a typical takeoff weight of about 60,000 pounds, with a maximum of 74,350 pounds, which is about double that of the F-14A's 40,000. This made it one of the heaviest fighter planes in the US arsenal. Considering stuff like that and the fact this plane is a damn transformer, old Grummy had to save some weight wherever possible, starting with the mounting structure for the wings, aka the Wingbox. Now, for those of you who don't speak aerospace engineer, the Wingbox is hands down one of the most important parts of the plane. It is basically the squat bar the entire weight of the plane is mounted to when the wings do all the lifting. And because it's usually enough, most people will make that Wingbox out of aluminum. Grumman took one look at that thing and said, nah, we're gonna make that bitch out of titanium. Because you gotta understand, they're trying to make a plane that will carry 6 of the biggest missiles ever made, plus 2 massive engines, plus a giant radar consuming the same amount of power as the average large American home that can track all those missiles at the same time. Not to mention the sheer mass of the nutsacks and or ovaries of the 2 people crazy enough to swing at an enemy bomber formation in a flying tennis court. Problem is that pure titanium literally rusts the minute it touches the air, and even more so when it heats up, like for example if you're welding it. And if they bolted it together, this thing could weigh up to 50% more. So in order to actually build this titanium wing box, Grumman had to weld them in a vacuum using an electron beam, requiring them to buy whole new manufacturing facilities from Boeing just for this purpose. Let me clarify that for you. Electron beam welding is a technique where a stream of electrons, basically a focused beam of radiation, are fired at a joint between 2 surfaces to heat them up via friction in a vacuum or a complete lack of air. What I am trying to tell you is that America is putting together their planes by shooting a laser beam of nuke dust to force 2 separate pieces of an outright rebellious metal to stick together inside of a homemade pocket dimension. This has to be the holy trifecta of reminding nature
That it is man who was made in God's image.
the blended wing body and the titanium wing box set the stage to prepare for the main event the Tomcat has to offer. Its swinging wings. The Tomcat's swing wings could T-pose to assert dominance over the takeoff and landing procedure at a 20-degree sweep angle. And when it needed to express mail spicy microwaves, it could sweep them back to a 68-degree Naruto run and punch through that sound barrier like the Kool-Aid Man. Although when they are swept back, there's something of an issue with that, because going supersonic means reducing the drag everywhere. And if you sweep the wings back, there's going to be that little tiny gap between the back of the plane and the wings, which is going to create more drag and also probably mess up your tail controls. Unless you do what Grumman did and stick a pair of canvas bags back there that are inflated by air from the engines and provide a smooth curve to cover up that gap. I thought canvas died in the biplane era because they couldn't handle high speeds. What's old is new again, apparently. Who would have thought cloth airplanes would be making a comeback at Mach 2?
Dude, this is walky as shit.
These wings could also swing back to 78 degrees for carrier storage, and in flight they were controlled by a flight computer that optimized their angle for lift-to-drag ratio. This could be manually overridden by a pilot to mount them in their position of choice, or individually if they really felt like spicing up the evening. Kinda like that one time they tested asymmetric sweep with NASA just to see what would happen, you know, just because. Although the wing sweep wasn't all sunshine and rainbows, because when you shift those suckers back, you end up throwing the center of lift so far back that when a Tomcat hits high speeds, the plane immediately decides that it wants to go on vacation to the Marianas Trench. Since you don't get break days on deployments, that wasn't an option, so the Tomcat got these little mini wings called glove vanes that would auto-deploy to give you some more smooth sailing. And by smooth sailing, I mean that if you wanted to turn left while going at the speed of God, you actually could. The F-14 could take a 7.5 G turn while going Mach 2. That is ridiculous. If the F-15 defies the laws of physics, then the F-14 defies the laws of aerodynamics. Can we just go back to the times when engineers were allowed to smoke whatever they had to get the job done?
Picked the wrong week. Quit sniffing glue.
Unfortunately, these vanes were a major maintenance headache, and since they were basically never used for real, later models removed them, and the existing cats got declawed with the doors welded shut. Even without them, though, there were still a lot of moving parts. Spoilers were used for roll control when the Tomcat was T-posing, and the elevators would sub in when the Tomcat was running from the hidden leaf. And if you really wanted to, the flaps could be engaged as ailerons when the wings were swept forward to boost the roll rate even more. That is a lot of moving parts, and the mechanics probably hated it, a judgment I make because the Tomcat required 30 to 60 hours of maintenance per 1 hour of flight. The media has been running around saying the F-35 is bad, with some sources quoting it as needing between 4.5 to 7.5 man-hours of maintenance per flight hour across all models, and calling that a big deal. The F-16 needs 17 hours of maintenance per flight hour, and the Tomcat is sitting up here at a max of 60. And with that many systems taking place and moving around, there is no feasible way pilots could actually keep pace with all of that themselves, which is why they were given what is arguably the most impressive part of the Tomcat. I'm talking about the F-14's Central Air Data Computer, or CADC, which also used the world's first microprocessor, aka the world's first digital computer core. This generation thought it was special with their latest PCs and highly unoptimized games, and here were some of their dads running around with one of the oldest point-and-click adventure games ever made. This is probably the first time we ever know of that a video game was classified, because nobody knew about this thing until the 90s. Probably because having a CADC on board going into battle was like opening up a hacking console in the middle of a fight.
Prepare to feel the wrath of a pissed-off nerd with admin privileges!
Even when the pilot engaged manual control of things like the swinging wings, the computer would still optimize the decision, making the plane more semi-automatic than full auto. It's like an acoustic fly-by-wire system, but without the aerodynamic instabilities and before the F-16 was cool. And on top of all that, the CADC would provide altitude, temperature, and airspeed data to the pilot and the other systems. Because as it turns out, the properties of air don't change in a straight line. More complex computations were needed to read those accurately at high altitudes, because the differences in things like air pressure would be almost the same even at majorly different altitudes. Finer detail, and therefore bigger units of memory or bigger bit storages, were required to process altitude accurately, and the microprocessor was needed for that to work right. To handle that kind of everything, the CADC computer performed 600 calculations every 18th of a second. And I don't mean just multiplying 1 times 1, I mean high-order polynomial functions, aka this bullshit right here. It even provided the weapon's telemetry data based on current state of flight to the tactical toasters, so they knew how to leave the plane, then correct trajectory and soar up into the air and over before spearing the enemies for days.
Bayonets for days.
It even had its own error diagnostic checks, and if something failed, it would activate a completely separate backup computer and flash a light at the pilot so they knew that playtime's over. But it's not like the computer would do everything for them. In fact, pilots would often open their own hacking console and manually override the wing sweep computer to either full forward for dogfighting or full back for flight. They never really cared for everything else in between. And since even back then people don't trust computers to handle everything for them, they would also pull out the circuit breaker that connected the inboard flaps of the Tomcat to the rest of the auto-deployment mechanism. Since deploying these flaps in a dogfight would mess up the airflow of the vertical tail fails, they instead decided to rig the system to only deploy the outboard flaps whenever in use, increasing their agility without messing up everything else. And because they're hands down all adrenaline junkies, they would also remove the G limiter so they could get away with harder turns. That didn't last too long though. The chain of command got curious on why their planes were finishing so fast, aka wearing through their maintenance cycles so quickly, so they installed measurement equipment on the D model to track their G-force history.
Destroy my browsing history, I must.
The Tomcat would also have some other cool spinning rims, like a nose gear that would compress 14 inches during lock-on for catapult, which would help springboard the nose into the air, or the fact the ejection seats were better than 0-0. Just so we're clear, a 0-0 ejection seat means the seat could launch from a standstill at ground level, aka 0 speed, 0 altitude. The F-14 seats were more like 0-10. This plane could eject you from 10 feet underwater like you're some kind of human submarine-launched ballistic missile. However, in spite of all these features, the Tomcat gets a bad rap for its flight performance overall compared to the F-15 and F-16. Not because it was a bad platform, but because the curse of the F-111B lives on.
Got main engines at 108%.
The F-14As got stuck with those 20,000-pound TF-30 turbofan engines, which kneecapped its thrust-to-weight ratio down to 0.87, and hard-capped its ability to fly in any way that it actually wanted to. These engines were so bad that in 1984, John F. Lehman, the Navy Secretary, was quoted as saying, "The F-14 was the worst airplane engine mismatch we have had in a long time," and the Iranians agreed. Their first Tomcat pilot, Major Ali, went so far as to say that a Tomcat pilot wasn't flying the plane, they were flying the engines, because the TF-30s were only ever made for aircraft meant to fly in straight lines. This left them extremely vulnerable to sudden changes in airflow entering them, caused by things like engine throttling and high AOA maneuvers, you know, basic fighter behavior. These moves would cause compressor stalls and even result in engine flameouts, ultimately causing a third of all Tomcat accidents. 40 Tomcats and several operators were lost to this, and what made it even harder to handle was that these engines may have been on the Tomcat, but their positioning might as well have been called spread eagle. The engine spacing for the Phoenix missiles would cause the plane to spin out if one engine failed, kind of like torquing a wrench. This is how we got the deaths of Goose and Top Gun, and the first death of a female US fighter jet pilot, Kara Hultgreen. During a landing approach, she was coming in off-center and yawed to correct, which disrupted the airflow into the left engine and stalled it out. This caused a major asymmetric thrust output that twisted the nose around even further, killing the left wing's lift and flipping it before she could eject. Pilots had to be given specialized flat spin training to compensate, but when you're falling at about -7 Gs and most people read out with training at -5, it's kind of a lose-lose situation. As a result, most of that training focused on avoiding the spin altogether, with the direct order written to eject if they got below 10,000 feet. The US Navy had to put up with the Tomcat's TF-30 issues through 557 A-model Tomcats until the late 1980s, when they would finally start receiving the F-14A pluses, which were later renamed the F-14B for simplicity. The only reason why they didn't go with that to start was because of the original F-14B prototype, which was tested with one of its intended F-401 engines on September 12, 1973. But between cost overruns on the project and inflation as a whole, that engine program was eventually scrapped, and the Navy had to wait around for a completely new engine development. That new engine was the General Electric F-110 turbofan, finally providing a respectable thrust output of 27,000 pounds. The F-110s were also smaller, lighter, and more fuel efficient, which made the B-model Tomcat almost a completely different plane. It had roughly 30% more range and a thrust-to-weight ratio of 1.08, which, while not better than the F-15C, wasn't matched by the F-16 until the E-Block 60s came out in the early 2000s. This engine was so powerful that Tomcat pilots couldn't light the afterburners during carrier takeoffs, or they would start outrunning their catapults. And the extra range they got was insane. The ACATs had a max fuel capacity of 18,000 pounds with drop tanks on, giving it a max range of 2,000 miles and a combat range of 765 miles. The F-35 has a combat radius of roughly 500-ish miles, if I'm remembering that right, and that engine upgrade now drops the Tomcat at about a 1,000-mile combat radius. Just for reference, and for no particular reason at all, I would like to mention that 1,000 miles is roughly the publicly accepted maximum range of China's anti-aircraft network. I'm gonna leave that there. 38 F-14Bs were built and 32 F-14As were given only the new engines as upgrades, while Iran would purchase 80 ACATs in 1974. The Persian Tomcats would start arriving in 1976, but the last one would not be delivered because of the Islamic Revolution in 1979. The Marines would consider adopting the Tomcats, but instead went with the F-4s and invested in the AV-8 Harriers. There were also plans for an F-14C attack and recon version, but much like a streamer saying something stupid, that got cancelled, leading the Navy to adopt the Tactical Airborne Reconnaissance Pod System, or TARPS pod, to fill that role instead. And at the top of the line, delivered in 1991, was the F-14D Super Tomcat. The Navy would get 37 new D-Cats and then upgrade 18 more A's to the D standard, which finally got their infrared search and track, or IRSTs, as well as night vision devices. The IRST would track heat signatures passively, allowing the Tomcat to look at targets without setting off a radar warning, which in turn gave the D-Cats a sort of acoustic sensor fusion by combining it with a more digitized radar to pick out the number of targets in the formation, or more clearly track ballistic missile launches during Desert Storm. 632 Tomcats would serve with the US until their retirement on September 22, 2006, largely due to parts reliability and maintenance costs, and possibly some interference by Dick Cheney and the Hornet Mafia, which I would appreciate your comments on since I couldn't find much about it. But while they wouldn't stick around with the US forever, they would still get their share of fun while they were there. But that story will have to wait for another time. Thank you for watching. We got merch and other links in the description, and if you like what you saw, please consider checking out some of my other videos. You might like what you find. Until next time, dismissed.